This is FE Peer Review, the Flat Earth Peer Review channel. The date is September 15th, 2020. The video under review is Reply to Umbra Penumbra Problem Close Sun by Mr. Thrive and Survive. I'll begin with a quick overview of the discussion from its start last June. On June 12th, Mr. Thrive and Survive put out a sort of challenge video regarding umbras and penumbras. Several people responded. On June 22nd, he put out a video acknowledging Mr. Sensible's response. In the interim, I had also prepared a video response to the challenge and left comments to that effect on Mr. Thrive and Survive's June 22nd video. I mention this to establish the fact that I sent to him certain information at that time. My video was not an attempt to meet his challenge. I simply wanted to present certain geometrical information that I believed would be useful to the discussion on all sides. Up until July 26th, Mr. Thrive and Survive basically went silent on the topic. Then he produced another video with a related question. Although I had already addressed tangentially his new question in my earlier video, I responded with a similar presentation focusing on the geometry of precisely the new question he raised. As usual, I left him a comment informing him of the fact. Again, silent for many weeks, on September 5th, Mr. Thrive and Survive produced another video in which he completely ignored all the geometric proofs I had prepared in the previous videos, and he proceeded to make a bunch of statements based on a complete misunderstanding of that same geometry. Every point he raised in the September 5th video I had already addressed last June and elaborated on one of them in August. So yet again, I left Mr. Thrive and Survive a comment. This one was lengthy, addressing each of his statements point by point with links to my original videos. I decided I should make a video version of this same response. Here it is. The comment is up on the screen. I don't expect you to be able to read it because I had to shrink the image to get everything to fit. I just wanted to establish that the comment appeared on Thrive and Survive's comment board. Mr. Thrive and Survive, these are your key points that are faulty. I addressed them in my original videos of June 23rd and August 5th. Your arguments were debunked by me weeks ago because I anticipated exactly this line of reasoning from you.
What happened was with the individuals, and I thank you once again for doing the work, who proved an Umbra Penumbra. What they actually proved is we have a close local sun, and I'm going to show that right here. They demonstrated in their videos that the Umbra Penumbra is produced when the blocking object, let's just say the sun, is much closer to the Earth.
No, the Umbra Penumbra is produced whenever the light source is larger than an infinitesimal point. Any light source that has a measurable angular size, regardless of its distance to the object being lit, will cause an Umbra Penumbra. The fact that a penumbra is seen tells us nothing about the distance to the light source. It only tells us about its angular size. However, the shape of the umbra does tell us something critical about the size of the light source. If the umbra gets smaller than the blocking object, as in your diagram at 157, then the light source must be larger than the blocking object. If the light source is smaller, it will cast an umbra that gets larger rather than smaller. I demonstrated this in my video of June 23rd. Here we see a point on the blue circle representing someone looking up at the sky and seeing a sun of an angular size of 0.5 degrees. That sun could be small and close, or it could be large and far away. In both cases, it would appear the same size to the person looking up at it from Earth. So looking at these two possibilities, what happens with shadows? On the lower image, we see a small sun. I've kept the larger off to the left just for reference. The small sun casts overlapping shadows and gives an umbra and penumbra. Looking at the larger sun in the upper image, we see that it does too. But in fact, there is a visible difference between the two. In the lower image, with the close and small sun, we see that the Earth's full shadow, the umbra, actually gets wider the further it gets from the Earth. Note the dashed lines, dashed white lines, which are parallel at the Earth's diameter. In the upper image, on the other hand, we see that the umbra actually does get narrower with distance. Note again the white lines. The reason for this is because the sun has a larger diameter than the Earth, while in the lower case the sun has a smaller diameter than the Earth. From this we can conclude that it is actually possible, through a very close measuring of objects' shadows, to determine a distance to the sun. Now in reality it would be a very imprecise result because of the practical problems of identifying the edges of the penumbra. Nonetheless, we could definitely determine one very important fact. If we meet the case in the upper image, the umbra actually does shrink. If we meet the case in the upper image and the umbra actually does shrink with distance, then the diameter of the sun must be larger than the diameter of the Earth. I've paused the video at this point because I want to reiterate this point. The size of the umbra tells us about the relationship between the size of the object blocking the light and the size of the object casting the light. If the umbra is smaller than the object blocking the light, the object casting light must be larger. So if the shadow of the Earth is smaller, if the umbra of the shadow of the Earth is smaller than the Earth, then the sun must be larger than the Earth. From that and the other piece of information we have about the sun, which is its angular size in the sky, 1/2 of a degree, from those two pieces of information we can determine a minimum distance of the sun from the Earth. Not the actual distance, but a minimum distance. We know that it must be larger than the Earth, and it must have an angular size of 1/2 a degree. There's no way for both of those things. There's no way for the Earth to cast an umbra that's smaller unless the sun is larger and consequently quite far away. This disproves the statement you made at 49 seconds into your video, quote, "What they actually proved is that we have a close local sun," unquote. No, that's not true. We proved, by virtue of the size of the umbra, that the sun is larger than the Earth, and based on it having an angular size of 1/2 a degree, must be considerably far from the Earth. It is neither close or local, and it's certainly not smaller than the Earth. At 1:41 in your video, you said, quote, "They demonstrated in their videos that the Umbra Penumbra is produced when the blocking object, when the sun is much closer to the Earth," unquote. No, what we showed you is that the object, so long as it has a measurable angular size, will cast an Umbra Penumbra pattern regardless of its size compared to the Earth and regardless of its distance to the Earth. The proportions of umbra to penumbra will change, but any object that has a measurable angular size, any light source that has a measurable angular size, will produce an umbra and a penumbra. That's what we showed. This is a clip from my video of August 5th. I've drawn a couple of diagrams here, two different diagrams, one above the other. And what we see is the blue circle represents the object that is casting the shadow. And then I have drawn two light sources, a closer light source, which is larger than the blue, and a more distant light source, which is larger still. And in the two diagrams, we will see the difference between the umbra penumbra geometry that each one produces. Let's start by looking at this close-up here of this top diagram. we have the light rays coming from the top edge, casting a shadow down in this zone, and then the light rays from the bottom edge casting an upper shadow, and we see the penumbra and the umbra, and we see a certain proportion between them. When we look at the lower diagram, I've left the little light source there just for reference, but now if we look at the lower diagram, the big circle on the left is our light source, and it casts umbra and penumbra pattern that is basically the same kind of shape, but slightly different proportions. And the difference is overlaying. I've overlaid one on the other in this smaller diagram at the bottom, which I will bring us in closer. The gray and black represent the close light source, and the dashed white lines are taken from this diagram of the more distant light source, and I've overlaid it on top so that you can compare them directly one to the other. What we see is very simply that the umbra and penumbra proportions depend on two factors: the size of the source and the distance of the source to the object casting the shadow. The size of the source is larger, but the distance is considerably farther. The size of the source is smaller, but the distance is closer, so the proportions of this pattern change. At 3:43, you made the following statement. I'm not going to repeat your entire video section here. Anybody who wants to hear the entire part can go and visit your video. I'm just going to give a few seconds of it for reference.
So now, how would the light rays, okay, crisscross to the Earth from that distance? Let's take a look at it two different ways.
This entire section suffers from a basic misunderstanding of the light source, whether it be the sun or a simple spherical light bulb like an old-style incandescent bulb. Every point on the surface of the sun casts light in all directions, 180 degrees. The top of the sun is casting rays in all directions, some of which hit the Earth, most of which don't. The same applies for the bottom of the sun. I anticipated this and addressed this precise misunderstanding in my video of June 23rd. For a start, we need to understand that every point on the surface of the sun, just as on a light bulb, is casting light in many directions. So if we look at a point on the sun at the bottom of the circle, we see that it is casting light in the direction of the Earth in such a way that the Earth's shadow is asymmetrical from the line connecting the centers of the sun and the Earth. That would be this narrow dashed line. Likewise, if we look at a point on the sun at the top of the circle, it's casting a similar shadow in the opposite orientation. Now, of course, every point on the sun that has a line of sight to Earth is casting its light towards the Earth. I've simplified these diagrams just to show the extreme edges. So when we look at the light from the sun casting what are effectively lots of shadows that overlap, we see a zone of shadow that is entirely in the dark. And on either side, we see zones where shadows cast by one part of the sun are lit by the other part. Consequently, they are not fully in the dark. I've simplified it in my diagram by only showing the extremes, but when you consider all the points on the sun, then the zone I've shown as light gray, here and here, becomes a gradation from fully shaded to fully lit. Fully shaded to fully lit. Starting at 5:27, you make a couple of statements that I will simply repeat here rather than go back to your video. Quote, "The rays of the sun strike the Earth at a 90-degree angle," unquote. Very strictly speaking, that is not correct. There is a very tiny divergence from 90 degrees. so for almost all practical purposes we can ignore it. At 5:32, you say, quote, "They have to strike at a 90-degree angle, otherwise you're not going to see the entire sun and we see the entire disk," unquote. In fact, we do not see the entire disk. We see a fraction of a percent less than the hemisphere that faces us. The same applies to the moon. We do not see half of the moon. We see a fraction less than half. Strictly speaking, no one would have to be an infinite distance away to see an entire half of the sphere of the sun or moon. This is very simple geometry. So long as the sphere we are looking at has a diameter that is less than the distance between our corneas, our eyeballs, we cannot see half of the sphere. For a graphic that shows this, check out the link. I've got some images of it on the screen. At 6:58, you say, with reference to light rays coming from the very top and bottom of the solar sphere, you say, "As you can see, they never strike the Earth," unquote. This is actually a proof of my point just above, that we do not actually see half of the sun. We see a fraction less than half. I suggest you approach this from the opposite direction. Pick a point on the Earth facing the sun and draw two lines from it that are tangent to the sun's disk. You will see that they look like the image on the screen here. They define an area of the sun that we see, which is slightly less than half. If you need me to do a presentation on this point, I'll be happy to put something together, but it really shouldn't be necessary. The basic concepts are very simple. Every point on the sun is casting light over 180 degrees. That means that every point on the sun that is visible to us on Earth, a tiny fraction less than the hemisphere facing us, is casting an array of light rays. All these light rays from all these points on the surface facing us are overlapping. The sun's angular size of 0.5 degrees defines the limits of divergence of these rays, and the multiplicity of them results in penumbras that are a gradient from full umbra to fully lit. At 8 minutes 0 seconds, you say, quote, "I look forward to hearing what people have to say about it," unquote. No, I don't think you look forward to it. I don't think you want to hear it, because I already addressed each of these points in my earlier videos, sent you links to them weeks ago, and you never bothered to listen. Instead, you produced this video that completely ignores them. I find it a bit absurd that you can come back with a video like yours that completely ignores the clear, simple geometric proofs I have presented, and then claim you want to hear what people have to say about it. It appears to me to be intellectual dishonesty on your part. I know I'm right about the simple geometric relationships I have shared with you today. I hope I'm wrong about your intellectual dishonesty. The evidence, one way or the other, will be in whether and how you reply to this.